and I thought I'd share just a little bit of mine because story is not just me in a vacuum, it's all of the people who have touched on our lives. Those of you who are pastors in the room or deacons in the room, rostered leaders in the room, raise your hand if you remember the first person that asked you if you ever thought about being a pastor. Those of you in other occupations, raise your hand if someone at one point or another in your life said, hey, have you ever thought about being a teacher, a CPA, a mathematician, what have you? A few hands out there. We have people looking out for us. I remember I was a sophomore at Augsburg College up in Minneapolis, Minnesota, among the frozen chosen Norwegians, and I love them to death. And I had a professor, and he looked at me. He had me in biblical studies, 8 in the morning. I was, I think, barely awake. And he said, have you ever thought about being a pastor? And I looked at him, and I said, no. And I left his office. 7 years later, I visit Luther Seminary, and I see Dr. Rolf Jacobson, and I look at him, and I say, well, it only took me 7 years, but here I am, and I've decided to be a pastor. Then, Dr. Richmond shared a bit of this earlier today. Then I come to Texas, and I didn't know what was going to happen in my life. I didn't know if ordination was going to happen. I had no idea what God was doing with me, but, I was at the threshold, and God had me by the nape of the neck and said, are you going to trust me? I'm like, I guess. And I got here, and I called Pastor Jane, and I said, I talked to Bishop Knaus. And Bishop Knaus said, we've been waiting for you. And it was either the creepiest thing I've ever experienced or the coolest thing I've ever experienced, and I'm more on the coolest side I've ever experienced. We have a synod that's looking out for you. We have churches that when you come through the doors say, we've been waiting for you. Now, they may not say it in so many words, depending on if you landed in one of those German or Norwegian congregations. We're a little, I think there's an old Ole and Lena joke that Ole loved Lena so much that he almost told her once. We've been waiting for you. God is waiting for you at the threshold. Also, a little more story. This picture back here is by John August Swanson. It is copyrighted. I hope that's okay. I hope nobody's going to come hunt us down because I used a copyrighted image. For my ordination, my husband bought me this picture, and I didn't think anything of it. And then it came time to write a dissertation, and I actually blame him that I wrote my dissertation on the parable of the prodigal son. All right, where we've been, check boxes, yay! We've talked about ancient ideas about identity formation and some modern ideas of identity formation. Today we're going to talk, this afternoon, it feels like a new day, we're going to talk about how God is forming us for the future. We'll discuss what happens when we're separated from what identifies us. And we'll learn about how telling stories makes new futures possible. I'll be depending heavily on Walter Brueggemann's Cadences of Home, Preaching Among the Exiles. I get no money from him for promoting his book. If you've not read it, I highly commend it to you. We'll imagine the parable of the prodigal sons and the loving father 20 to 30 years into the future. And, spoiler alert, the church and Christians and the world are always under construction. Okay, recap. Our identities are shaped or constructed by our interaction with each other. And our confession is shaped by our understanding of who God is and who we are in light of that. As I said about the confession, I was omitting that we were going to be having communion today. So I don't know about you all, but I actually myself really was rethinking about how God's reconstructing us all. And our stories happen in the middle of everything, as does the story of the prodigal sons and the loving father. So at one point or another in all of our lives and in varying ways, whether you identify as the rule-following elder brother who's always been by your parents' side, always dutiful, or whether you're the prodigal that has experienced physical separation and geographical separation, during various seasons of our life, we're separated from what we love. Some seasons, we're separated from what we love about ourselves. I don't know, I hope none of you have ever experienced this, but given that we're all humans, I'm guessing there have been seasons where some of your favorite parts of yourself seem to be sleeping or dormant or gone, and you're living into this new reality of who am I now? Who are we when we find the wilderness places? Who are we when we cross the threshold and find a vast openness? Who are we in exile? One of the themes that is prominent in the Hebrew imagination is the theme of exile, the theme of this separation from God, this theme of the joy and anticipation of coming home. So Adam and Eve were separated from the garden. Cain was separated. Abraham, go from your country. When you tell your children, my father was a wandering Aramean, we're talking about Abraham. Jacob, when he had stolen Esau's birthright and gotten the blessing, and Esau was coming after him, what did he do? He ran. Joseph, his brothers sold him into slavery. Judah and Israel, the people of God, were separated by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And the squandering son was separated from home, and as was his brother. The disciples were separated. The end of Luke. Jesus, remember the road to Emmaus narrative. Jesus is walking on the road, and he meets two disciples, and they don't recognize him. They're separated from him, even though he's right in front of them. And I wonder how frequently are we separated from Christ when he's standing right in front of us? Stranger, don't you know what's happened these past 3 days? Don't you know a man died? I really want to know what Jesus was thinking at that point in time. Okay, so talk a little bit about Walter Brueggemann. He's an Old Testament scholar, Presbyterian, but I'll still let him in. He says, the danger in exile is to become so preoccupied with the self that one cannot get outside oneself to rethink, reimagine, and redescribe the larger reality. And for me, in some ways, this touches on where we are today. This book was written a while ago. I read it during seminary. It was published in 1997. And it's interesting to me how prescient these words are, how much sense they make to us today. As we are in a culture that increasingly circles the wagons and values separation over unity, it's hard to get outside of ourselves when our inclination is to protect and to insulate. But it's hard to see the solution to a problem when we're right up against it. I don't know, how many of you ever had a problem that you felt like you couldn't solve at the time, and then looking back, you're like, wow, I would have done that really differently if I had to do it again? Anybody? Yeah. Hindsight is 20/20. Brueggemann goes on to say, in the exile, the doxologies or the praises are not primarily acts of remembering God's past wonders, but anticipatory assertions concerning about what God is about to do. So God is about to do something. What is God about to do? And what should we be doing if we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that God is on the move and God is about to do something? What does that mean for us and our posture and our relationship to the world, each other, and Scripture? So the basic premise of the book, or the takeaway from this book, is that telling stories makes a new future possible. Brueggemann asserts that literally by preaching a different future, the prophets of Israel made that future possible, the homecoming. I'll give you a little more Brueggemann and then we'll move on. Israel's most daring and definitional promises were uttered in exile, that is, precisely when the evidence seems to preclude such hope. Isaiah 55, come to the waters. Jeremiah 31, I will give you a law and I will put it on your hearts. Ezekiel 37. O mortal, can these bones live? Is anybody familiar with that story? The ankle bone, the foot bone's connected to that? I don't know the whole song, but hear the word of the Lord. There's this vision of these bones coming together. It's the zombie apocalypse before that was ever a thing. They told the best stuff on TV. It comes from the Bible, I'm telling you what. Ezekiel 37, there's this vision of these people coming together, but there's no breath in them. And what does he do to get the breath into him? Prophesy, mortal. Tell these bones that they're alive. What happens if we're about the business of looking at each other and saying, you're alive? What are you going to do? In Joel 2, your sons and daughters shall have visions. Your old men will dream dreams. The community will come together and envision a future that doesn't seem possible. And trivia moment, does anybody know where Joel 2 comes up again in the New Testament? Hey, well done. Acts 2, the day of Pentecost, when God is really doing a new thing. Am I being recorded? Oh, okay, well, I'm going to do it anyway. My new favorite image for God, this might offend some of your sensibilities, but my new image for God, when humans are struggling, my new image for God is God just looking over at Gabriel and being like, hold my beer, watch what we're going to do. God is up to stuff, folks. God is on the move, and he's moving through y'all. The preacher traffics in a fiction that makes things true. Now, I'm going to push you a bit on this. Those of you who say, oh, good, it's the pastor's job. My good friend Martin Luther, who does he think the preachers are? The baptized. So none of us are getting out of this. None of us get out of the gospel. None of us get out of those baptismal promises before we even know what love is. We are loved. Before we know what sin is, we are forgiven. Before we know what it is to come home, our Father is waiting at the threshold with open arms. So, by imagining the story anew, we make a new future, and I think God's intended future possible, because as we imagine, God is there. As we dream of a new future, God is there. A man had 2 sons. This is a little embarrassing because I actually didn't bring an English Bible with me. Anyway, so a man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to him, Father, give to me what is falling to me of my inheritance. And he divided his patrimony among them. And after several days, the younger had gathered everything, and he took off for a far country, and he spent everything living recklessly. Having exhausted everything, there came a great famine, and he began to experience in that country, and he began to experience want. And he joined himself with one of the citizens of that country, and he got a job feeding pigs. I'm paraphrasing a little bit because I wasn't prepared to look at my Greek today. So fill in the blanks. And so he longed to fill himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. But coming to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have abundant bread, but here I am perishing in this famine? Rising, I know what I will do. I will rise and I will go to my father and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. And rising, he went to his father. And while he was still far off, his father saw him, and he ran and embraced him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father interrupted him and said, to his slave, "Quick, go bring me the best robe and put it on him, and a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and bring the fatted calf and sacrifice it." And they began to celebrate. Now I'm really going to paraphrase because I'm getting tired. Okay, so the elder son is in the field, and he hears this party going on. What the heck? I wasn't even invited. And so he talks to one of the slaves, and he said, "What's going on?" They said, "Your brother has returned home safe and sound, and they're throwing a party in his honor." And the elder son became angry and refused to go in. And the father went out to him. And he said, "Father, I've been with you all this time, and you never even gave me a goat, and yet this horrible beep, 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 beep son of yours came home, and you slaughtered the fatted calf. It's not fair." The father looked at him and said, "Child, everything I've had, everything I will have is yours. But this brother of yours was dead, and he's been raised. He was lost, and he's come home. We had to celebrate." So, now your job. I want you to fast forward the story by any unit of time that you like. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years. Who's there? Is the father still living? What are the brothers like? Do they get along? Are they both home? Fast forward the story into the future and tell the story again. Where are they at? I'll give you a few minutes. All right, I'm going to bring us back together. Thanks for sharing with one another. Now I'm curious, how many of y'all's groups kind of cleaned up the story and the brothers started getting along after at the end of the parable? You gave it a possibility. How many of you all decided that the elder brother was going to make the younger brother his slave or something like that? You guys are such Lutherans. I think one of my professors described it. He said, I have a very low anthropology, but a very high Christology, because of all the work Christ has to do for us. Yeah, and I think that tells the truth of the story. How does the gospel show up in real life where families don't get reconciled? And is God there? And can a different future be made possible there? We don't necessarily get a magic wand to make everything work the way we want to and to make, I'm sure everybody's church councils all get along perfectly. There's no contention on the church councils or in leadership. Although Pastor Irma, hearing about choosing carpet color, I think y'all need to help us with carpet color choices. All right. So, no matter where we are in our stories, how we tell them shapes the future. Now, the brothers may not have reconciled, and the father may have passed on seeing the boys still fighting, in which case they're like a real family, many of which some of us have come into contact with. But if Brueggemann is right, and I think he is, the church is always under construction. We're always imagining new futures, and we're always leaning into what God has in store for us. God may watch families, along with all the rest of us, not reconcile. But I'm not sure if that's the intended future that God has for us. And I think sometimes a lot of it can be attributed to a failure in imagination. The good news is that God is not and will never be finished with us. We are always under construction. And as Christopher reminded us this morning, that construction, the honest truth of it is that it's not always comfortable. It's not always fun to be the one coming home with your tail between your legs. And it's not always fun to be the elder brother who everyone's expecting you to do the right thing when the right thing feels unjust. How do you take home a brother who's squandered everything, potentially impinging on your own livelihood? What does that look like? And how is God there? In most interpretations of the parable of the prodigal, the father, interpreters relegate the father to God. God is willing to cross the threshold for the prodigals and the rule followers alike. And I think sometimes the prodigals think that God can't find them wherever they go. And the elder brothers feel lost even though they're right next door. But I think key is that all of these characters at different points in their life might have told a different story. We don't know what happens with the elder brother. It sounds like y'all would get along well with Aristotle in the first century mindset. Was like, nope, he's going to stay that way. But a little more personally, as an oldest sibling and as a rule follower, and as a stubborn rule follower, I never realized the fear my siblings had. On the one hand, I'm kind of my siblings' moral compass, which is a terrible thing to be, but welcome to family systems. That's the one I landed in. I was completely devastated, on the other hand, when I heard how much they feared my judgment. And I had no idea that they were fearful that I would judge them. Because they're my brothers and my sisters. So what is it like to be an elder brother when judgment's the furthest thing from your mind? I mean, that's just my own life. I don't know if you all have stories of that where you're genuinely open and the door is still shut. What is God constructing in you? What new future do you want to see in your churches? What possibilities is God imagining for you? Because if God can imagine the world, the stars, and everything in it, if God can imagine saving us through an infant, through this story that seriously makes no sense, friends. Virgin birth? Anybody? Parting of the Red Sea, healing people, raising the dead, being resurrected to new life. We follow a God that looks at impossibility and says, I got this. And I wonder what would happen if we started imagining the way God imagines. Because in your baptisms, you didn't just get the charge to chase after God. It's God's charge to chase after you. God is at the threshold, and paradoxically, God brings us to the threshold of ourselves, of one another, of our families, of our congregations. And there's always that invitation to imagine a different future. What happens the next time you're trying to pick out carpet in your congregation? I'm just going to stick with that for a minute. What happens if you are picking out new carpet and some people say green and some people say blue and some people say red and God help them, some people say white. Don't put white carpets in your church. I mean, God bless you if you have white carpets in your churches, but what happens that moment you take a step back and say, what is God imagining? What does God imagine for our future together? Does God imagine us worrying about the carpet color? Or does God imagine us being unified in Christ, in mission together, at the threshold, for the sake of the church and for the sake of the world? Thanks again, y'all.
Thank you, Dr. Brobst-Renaud. We've appreciated it. Dr. Mandy, I'll call you that now that we've gotten through this process. Let's give her another round of applause for all the work that she did. These three sessions, I knew they would. They have definitely enlightened me to think about this parable in a new way. When I knew this was her topic, I thought, seriously, we're going to do that again? But the parable of the prodigal son, like many of the stories of Scripture, do indeed mean different things to us at different times in our life. And what a great, great thing to have you with us. We're grateful for all your work. These things just don't happen out of the blue. There's a lot of work goes into it. And did you notice she was reading her Nestle Aland there? Yeah? That's a little law to me. All right. Thanks. But it's a reminder when people talk about PhD level work and being a scholar of the church, that's the kind of effort and energy that's put into that kind of work. And so we are grateful for that. We're grateful for Ben and Hugo for loaning you to us this weekend. And we will certainly be watching and hearing great things at Valparaiso. And when the winds off of Lake Michigan get too cold, you're always welcome home.